For 112 years, humanity had been a loyal member of the Galactic Coalition. 112 years of shared wars, shared trade, shared sacrifices. Human soldiers had fought and died in coalition conflicts on the other side of the galaxy. Wars that had nothing to do with Earth, nothing to do with human interests, fought simply because the coalition asked and humanity honored its commitments. Human engineers had helped build coalition infrastructure. Human doctors had treated coalition wounded. Human diplomats had spent generations carefully, patiently building the kind of trust that most species took centuries to establish. None of it mattered on the morning the coalition turned. The announcement came without warning, without a final meeting, without even the courtesy of a private message sent to Earth before the public broadcast. It simply appeared simultaneously across every major communication channel in known space, cold, formal, and absolute. The Galactic Coalition hereby declares the human species an unacceptable threat to long-term galactic stability. Immediate corrective action is authorized by unanimous vote of all 12 member civilizations. Across the galaxy, independent observers watching the broadcast went completely silent. Neutral civilizations stopped their daily operations to read the declaration twice, certain they had misunderstood something. Smaller species who had always looked to the coalition as a model of organized, principled galactic governance stared at their screens in genuine disbelief. Humans had never broken a treaty, never violated a coalition agreement, never once turned their military against an ally. The reasoning was buried deep in the official declaration, written in careful clinical language that tried to make something fundamentally unjust sound like simple mathematics. Humanity was growing too fast. Population expanding, technology advancing, military capability developing at a rate no other species in recorded galactic history had matched. Within 2 generations, according to coalition projections, humans would be the single most powerful force in the known galaxy. The coalition had decided it was easier to act now, while they still held the advantage, than to face that reality later. In the coalition's war chamber, 12 civilizations finalized their combined fleet deployment, the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history, drawn from every member state, coordinated for a simultaneous strike against Earth and every major human colony at once. War Marshal Then, the coalition's supreme military commander, reviewed the fleet deployment with quiet satisfaction. The numbers were overwhelming. Even if humanity mobilized every available ship immediately, the gap in pure military strength was too large to overcome through conventional means. This would be fast, clean, decided before humanity had time to recover from the initial shock. Near the back of the war chamber, a single figure did not share his satisfaction. Her name was Sasara, one of the coalition's senior diplomats, and the only member of the 12 Civilization Council who had voted against the declaration. She had spent 30 years of her career building the human coalition relationship from its earliest, most fragile stages into the strong, functional alliance it had become. She had argued against this decision with every tool available to her: historical data, economic projections, diplomatic precedent, simple moral reasoning. She had told the Council plainly that humans had done nothing to deserve this, that projections about future capability were not the same as present threat, and that launching a war against the most loyal ally the coalition had ever had would define the coalition's legacy in ways no military victory could erase. She lost the vote 12-1. Now, she sat in silence at the edge of the war chamber, watching decades of careful, patient relationship building collapse in a single afternoon, powerless to stop what was already in motion. The fleet began moving within the hour. Across human space, the reaction came in stages. First, confusion, communications teams and government officials reading the declaration repeatedly, searching for context that would make it make sense. Then disbelief, spreading from government centers outward through colonies and stations and civilian populations who had grown up thinking of the coalition as allies, as partners, as something close to friends. Then something quieter settled across human space. Harder to name. Not panic, not grief exactly. Something colder and more focused than either. In Earth's Central Command, senior military officers and government leaders gathered quickly, their expressions tight but controlled. Reports flooded in from every sector, Coalition fleet movements, deployment patterns, the scale of the force being assembled against them. The numbers were precise and deeply unfavorable. A young communications officer, hands steady despite everything, looked up from her station with a single question. "What do we send back?" The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewports, space looked exactly as it always had, dark and still and indifferent to whatever happened inside it. The senior commander present looked at the communication panel for a long moment, then spoke 2 words: "Send it." The message went out simultaneously across every open channel in known space, not encrypted, not targeted, broadcast freely for any civilization in the galaxy to receive. It reached the Coalition war chamber, while Then's fleet was still in the early stages of its deployment. It reached neutral civilizations watching the situation with growing alarm. It reached Sasara's personal communication terminal in the corner of the war chamber where she sat alone. Every civilization in the galaxy received the same message at the same moment. 1 word: run. War Marshal Then read the message once, then set it aside. 1 word. No fleet movements accompanying it. No defensive broadcasts. No formal declaration of war in response to the Coalition's own declaration. Just a single quiet word sent across open channels for the entire galaxy to receive. Then senior officers reacted with laughter. Short, genuine, slightly disbelieving laughter at the sheer simplicity of it. After all the preparation, all the careful fleet deployment, all the strategic planning, humanity's response to the largest military force ever assembled against them was 1 word that didn't even constitute a threat. "Run," one officer repeated, still smiling. That's all they sent. "Clearly they're frightened," another concluded. "They don't know what else to say," then allowed the laughter to settle before bringing the room back to focus. He agreed with his officer's general assessment. 1 word was not a military response, and a frightened species broadcasting bravado across open channels was exactly the kind of behavior his pre-attack psychological models had predicted. Shock followed by noise, followed by collapse. He moved on to fleet positioning updates and thought nothing more about it. Sasara, however, sat with the message for a long time. She read it repeatedly, the same way she had read thousands of human diplomatic communications over 30 years, not just for what they said, but for what they chose not to say. Human communication, she had learned early in her career, was often most meaningful in its restraint. What humans left out of a message was frequently more important than what they included. This message included almost nothing. 1 word sent calmly to everyone simultaneously, with no follow-up. Sasara thought about every piece of human intelligence she had gathered over 3 decades of diplomatic work. Not the political material. She knew that thoroughly. She started instead from the beginning, pulling up the older files. The military architecture assessments, the infrastructure development records, the long-term strategic planning documents that human officials had shared openly during the Alliance years. Never flagged as sensitive because they had always been framed as defensive rather than offensive. She read through them with fresh eyes, spending hours working through material she had filed away as background context and never looked at again. By the time she finished, the laughter in the war chamber felt very far away. Human military doctrine she discovered across dozens of documents operated on a principle so consistent it appeared in nearly every strategic framework they had ever published. The principle was simple, stated plainly in a human military handbook she found in the older diplomatic files. Maintain all alliances fully and faithfully. Trust your partners completely. Never plan for betrayal, but always quietly prepare for it. Not because humans were paranoid, not because they distrusted their allies, simply because they had studied enough history, their own and others, to understand that circumstances changed, alliances shifted, and a species that could only survive within the protection of existing partnerships was a species permanently dependent on the goodwill of others. So alongside every coalition partnership, every shared military exercise, every open treaty, humanity had been quietly maintaining something else entirely. Independent military infrastructure, weapon systems, fleet programs, defensive networks, developed steadily over generations, never shared with coalition intelligence because it was never classified as an active program, just capability, held in reserve, updated quietly, never announced, just in case. Cesara set down the final document and stared at the wall of her small office for a long, still moment. Run, she thought. They sent the word run. Not to threaten, not to boast, not as a declaration of war or a response to the Coalition's declaration. As a warning. The kind of warning you sent to someone you respected enough to give a head start. The kind of warning that assumed the recipient was smart enough to understand what it meant, without having it explained. The kind of warning that, if ignored, placed full responsibility for the consequences on the people who chose not to. Listen, she stood immediately and went to find. Then his staff blocked her twice before she invoked a formal, diplomatic privilege and a legal mechanism she had never used in 30 years of service, reserved for situations where a diplomatic officer had information directly relevant to the safety of coalition forces, then couldn't legally deny it. She had 5 minutes. She stood in front of him and said it plainly, without preamble, without softening. The word they sent isn't a bluff. It isn't bravado. It's a warning. They've been preparing for this scenario for decades. Not this specific betrayal, but any betrayal. We are walking into something we don't fully understand yet, and every hour we continue moving forward without reassessing is an hour we can't get back. Then studied her for a long moment, his expression carefully neutral. Based on what evidence? He asked. Based on 30 years of reading their documents more carefully than our intelligence teams did, she replied. Another long pause. The fleet is already moving, Cesara, he said finally. The vote was unanimous. My orders are clear, she looked at him steadily. I know. I'm asking you to slow down long enough to consider whether those orders were based on accurate information. He thanked her for her concern, told her it had been noted, and returned to his fleet positioning reports. Cesara walked back to her office, sat down, and began preparing a document she hoped would never be needed. A full record of everything she had found. Everything she had warned about and exactly when she had warned about it, just in case. The Coalition fleet crossed into the outer edge of human space on the 4th day of deployment. It was an enormous force. Hundreds of warships drawn from 12 civilizations, organized into tight formation groups, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that only comes from years of joint military exercises and shared tactical doctrine. By any conventional measurement, it was an unstoppable force approaching what should have been an overwhelmed defense. What it found instead was a thin, quiet line of human ships positioned at the boundary of human territory. Far, fewer than Coalition intelligence had projected based on known human fleet numbers. Then's analysts processed the discrepancy quickly and settled on the most reassuring explanation available. The surprise declaration had worked. Humanity hadn't had enough time to fully mobilize its available fleet strength. The ships in front of them were whatever had been close enough to deploy quickly, not a calculated defensive force. Then ordered the advance to continue. The engagement that followed lasted 11 minutes. It was not what anyone on either side of the conflict would later describe as a battle. The human ships did not charge the Coalition fleet. They did not attempt to hold their position against overwhelming numbers. They did not broadcast desperate communications or attempt any kind of negotiation under fire. They simply fought for 11 minutes, precisely, efficiently, with a level of tactical coordination that surprised Then's officers despite their confidence, and then withdrew. Clean and organized, pulling back in a specific direction without panic, without disorder, without leaving anything behind that couldn't afford to be left. 3 Coalition ships took minor damage. No human ships were lost. Then recorded it as a clean first victory in his operational log and ordered the fleet to advance deeper into human space, momentum high and confidence intact. In the tactical analysis room adjacent to the main bridge, a young Coalition intelligence officer named Verath was reviewing the engagement data with a small team. His job was to find anything unusual in the battle, recordings, anything that didn't fit the expected pattern of a species scrambling to defend itself against an overwhelming force. He found something almost immediately, though it took him an hour to be certain he wasn't misreading it. The human ships had been running sensor sweeps throughout the entire 11-minute engagement. Continuous, detailed, systematic sweeps, cataloging Coalition fleet composition, weapon discharge signatures, shield frequency patterns, formation spacing, and response timing with a thoroughness that made no tactical sense for a force that was supposedly defending a border. Defensive forces conserved their sensor capabilities during combat. They focused on immediate tactical information. They didn't run comprehensive fleet analysis sweeps during active engagement, unless the engagement itself was secondary to something else, unless the real purpose of the engagement wasn't to defend the border at all. Verath pulled up the withdrawal pattern next. The direction the human ships had retreated wasn't toward Earth, wasn't toward the nearest major human colony, wasn't toward any concentration of human military infrastructure that appeared on Coalition maps. It was toward a region of space that Coalition charts marked as sparsely populated, a stretch of mostly empty systems with minimal strategic value, the kind of area that military planners marked as low priority and rarely looked at twice. He cross-referenced the human navigational data shared during the Alliance years, pulling up older records from the diplomatic files that Sisara's team had compiled over 3 decades of partnership. The region wasn't empty. At least it hadn't been empty 20 years ago, when a series of small human construction projects had been registered in that area, registered openly, categorized as infrastructure development, filed under the kind of bureaucratic language that made things easy to overlook and difficult to remember. Verath sat with his findings for a long moment, then went to find Sisara rather than Then. She read his report in under 2 minutes, then looked up at him with an expression that told him she had already been thinking about the same region of space. They withdrew toward it deliberately, Verath said quietly. Yes, Sisara replied, which means the engagement wasn't about holding the border. No, she agreed. It was about measuring us and pointing us in the right direction. She thought about the word again and the single broadcast sent across. Every open channel before the fleet had even entered human space. Run. She had spent days trying to understand exactly what it meant and for whom it was intended. She was beginning to suspect it hadn't been sent to the Coalition at all. It had been sent to everyone else. Every neutral civilization watching the conflict. Every independent observer following the fleet's movements. The entire galactic community, witnessing in real time what was about to happen. Not a threat directed at the Coalition, a warning directed at the galaxy, so that when the conflict resolved, every civilization watching would be able to say clearly that humanity had warned the Coalition exactly what would happen. And the Coalition had chosen not to listen. She pulled up the construction records from the diplomatic files again, staring at the region of space Verath had identified. 20 years of quiet building, officially logged, never hidden. Simply never examined carefully by Coalition intelligence because it had never seemed important. It was very important. She went to find Then again, this time with Verath's data in hand. This time, she wasn't asking him to slow down. She was telling him to stop. Then listened to Sisara's full presentation this time. Not because he had changed his mind about the campaign. Not because her earlier warning had softened his confidence. But because Verath's sensor analysis data was specific enough and unusual enough that dismissing it entirely would have been professionally irresponsible, and Then was, whatever else he was, a careful military commander. He studied the withdrawal patterns. He reviewed the sensor sweep data from the engagement. He looked at the construction records Sisara had pulled from the diplomatic files and the registered infrastructure projects in the region of space. The human ships had retreated toward. Then he sat quietly for a moment, weighing everything in front of him. This is consistent with a withdrawal toward an unprepared position, he said finally. Species under pressure don't always retreat toward strength. Sometimes they retreat toward whatever space is available. These ships didn't retreat toward available space, Sisara replied, keeping her voice even. They retreated toward a specific region, along a specific heading, in a specific formation that left their sensor arrays facing backward toward us throughout the entire withdrawal. They were measuring our pursuit pattern. They wanted to know exactly how we follow. Then looked at the data again. Even if you're correct, he said slowly, the fleet is already deep into human space. Stopping now concedes everything we've taken without completing the operation. Stopping now preserves every ship and every crew member we have, Sisara replied. Continuing means advancing into territory we don't fully understand. toward a region we haven't properly analyzed, following a path that at least 2 independent datasets suggest was designed to lead us exactly where we're going. Another silence. I'll order a full intelligence reassessment before we advance further. Then said finally, 3 days. If the analysis finds nothing actionable, we continue. It was the right decision. Sisara knew it. Verath knew it. Even Then knew it. Somewhere beneath the weight of unanimous council votes and fleet deployment momentum. It was also 3 days too late. While Then's intelligence teams began their reassessment, the human ships that had withdrawn after the first engagement continued moving, not dispersing, not regrouping toward Earth, but flowing quietly and steadily deeper into the region the Coalition charts marked as strategically low value. And then the second engagement happened, not initiated by the Coalition fleet, which was holding position per Then's order. Initiated by a second, separate group of human ships that appeared from a different direction entirely. Smaller, faster, clearly not the same force that had withdrawn earlier. They struck 2 Coalition supply vessels at the rear of the fleet formation, disabled them cleanly without destroying them, and withdrew in the same direction as the first group, toward the same region, along the same general heading. The message was clear to anyone paying attention. This wasn't a retreating force. This was an active one, operating on multiple fronts simultaneously, consistently pointing the same direction. Then's intelligence reassessment was still running when a third engagement occurred. Another small, fast group of human ships, different again from the previous 2, striking from yet another angle and withdrawing immediately toward the same region of space. 3 separate engagements, 3 separate human forces, all withdrawing to the same place. In his office, Verath updated his analysis with the new engagement data and stared at the pattern it produced on his mapping display. The human withdrawal routes, plotted together, formed something that looked less like a retreating military and more like a set of carefully drawn directions. He thought about something he had read once in a human tactical manual during the Alliance. Years. A document shared openly as part of a joint training program, which he had read briefly, found interesting, and then filed away and forgotten. The manual described a concept humans called channeling, the practice of using controlled retreats, deliberate engagements, and carefully managed information to guide an enemy force toward a position of your choosing rather than theirs. Not running from the enemy, running in front of them, leading them one careful step at a time, exactly where you needed them to go. He closed the analysis display and sat very still for a moment. Then he wrote a single line at the bottom of his report and sent it directly to Sisara. We are not chasing them. They are leading us. Sisara read the message, forwarded it immediately to Then's desk marked urgent, and went to the observation deck to look out at the stars. The region the human forces kept retreating toward sat in the distance, dark and quiet and unremarkable on every scanner the Coalition fleet possessed. Whatever was out there, it had been built carefully enough and far enough from standard patrol routes that 20 years of quiet construction had produced nothing that appeared on any Coalition military map. She thought about what it would take to build something significant enough to matter in that region, the planning, the resources, the patience required to maintain a construction program for 2 decades without drawing attention, all while simultaneously being a fully engaged, fully cooperative Coalition ally. She thought about the word again. Run. They had sent it before a single ship had crossed into human space. Before the first engagement. Before any of this had begun, they had known, even then, exactly how this would unfold. She stayed on the observation deck for a long time, watching the dark region of space where 3 separate human forces had now withdrawn, waiting quietly for whatever came next. The gravitational disruption field activated without warning. One moment, the Coalition fleet was holding position at the edge of the region. Their intelligence teams had been reassessing for 3 days. The next moment, every faster-than-light navigation system across hundreds of ships simultaneously displayed the same error, a cascading failure of drive calibration that no engineering team could immediately explain. Then the communications went down, not all at once. Station by station, relay by relay, The network of communication systems that connected the Coalition fleet to its home civilizations began dropping offline. Each failure quiet and clean. No dramatic power surge, no visible attack. Simply a signal that had been present for days becoming absent. Within 20 minutes of the field's activation, the entire Coalition fleet was sitting in a pocket of space where faster-than-light travel was impossible. External communication was impossible, and reinforcement was therefore impossible. Every ship was fully intact. Every weapon system was fully operational. Every crew member was unharmed. None of it mattered. Then stood on his flagship bridge surrounded by officers reporting system failures he had no framework to explain. Because the technology producing them hadn't appeared in any Coalition intelligence assessment of human military capability. It hadn't appeared because it hadn't existed, as far as Coalition intelligence knew, until the moment it activated around 300 Coalition warships simultaneously. 20 years of quiet construction in a region of space no one had looked at carefully enough. Not weapons, not in the traditional sense. Infrastructure. A network of human-built stations, positioned carefully across the region, producing overlapping fields that made the area around them functionally impassable for any fleet that hadn't been designed specifically to navigate through them. The Coalition fleet had been led here, step-by-step, engagement by engagement, withdrawal by withdrawal, every human retreat pointing the same direction until the largest military force in galactic history was sitting exactly where humanity needed it to sit. Sisara stood near the back of the bridge, watching Then's officers work through the implications of their situation with increasing urgency. She felt no satisfaction. She had tried to prevent this. She had failed. What she felt now was something closer to a deep, exhausted sorrow, not for the Coalition fleet specifically, which was intact and unharmed, but for the relationship that had existed before the vote, the trust that had been built over a century of genuine partnership, and the ease with which 12 civilizations had chosen to throw it away, based on a projection about a future that hadn't happened yet. Across the galaxy, something else was happening simultaneously. The second human broadcast went out, again on every open channel, again simultaneous, again clearly intended for the entire galactic community, rather than the Coalition specifically. It was longer than the first message. Calm, factual, and precise in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. It described what had happened, the Coalition declaration, the fleet deployment, the first engagement and every engagement after it, the gradual, patient process by which the Coalition fleet had been guided to its current position, the activation of the disruption field network, the current status of the Coalition fleet, intact, unharmed, unable to leave. It ended with a single paragraph directed specifically at every neutral and independent civilization watching the conflict. Humanity provided one warning before this conflict began. That warning was ignored. The situation that has resulted is the direct and sole consequence of the Galactic Coalition's decision to act against a species that had done nothing to deserve it. We hold no anger toward the crews of the ships currently in our custody. We hold no interest in escalation. We hold only one interest: correcting what the Coalition did, through terms that prevent it from being done again. In government chambers across dozens of neutral civilizations, the broadcast was received and immediately discussed at emergency sessions. Some were alarmed by the demonstration of human capability, the scale of construction, the patience of the operation, the completeness with which the Coalition fleet had been contained. Others were struck by something different: the precision with which humanity had avoided causing casualties, the deliberate choice to contain rather than destroy, the careful distinction drawn between the Coalition leadership's decision and the crews who had carried it out. One small, independent Civilizations Council member, watching the broadcast in a crowded chamber full of anxious colleagues, said something quietly that several of her peers later remembered clearly. "They could have destroyed that fleet," she said. "They chose not to. They chose to make a point instead of making an example." A colleague looked at her. "Isn't that more frightening?" She considered the question carefully. "It's more instructive," she said finally. "A species that destroys enemies is dangerous. A species that contains them, carefully and completely, and then offers terms, that species understands something about power that most of us haven't learned yet." On the Coalition flagship, Then received a third message from humanity, this one private narrowband, directed specifically to his personal command terminal. It was short, calm, the same tone as everything else humanity had communicated throughout the entire conflict. Grand Marshal Then, your fleet is intact. Your crews are safe. The field around you will remain active until an agreement is reached. We recommend reaching one. We are ready to negotiate whenever you are. Then read the message twice. Then he set it down on his desk and sat very still for a long time, staring at nothing in particular. Beside him, quiet and patient, Sisara waited. Then made his decision before the end of the first day inside the disruption field. He didn't announce it immediately. He spent several hours reviewing options with his senior officers, not because he expected to find a better alternative, but because 30 years of military command had taught him that decisions made under pressure needed to be examined from every angle before being acted on, even when the correct answer was already clear. His officers proposed 6 different approaches. 2 involved attempting to force a path through the disruption field, using concentrated fleet firepower against the human stations producing it. Then had his engineering teams model both approaches carefully. The models were not encouraging. The station network was too distributed, too redundant, and positioned at distances that made simultaneous targeting impossible. Destroying enough stations to create a viable exit corridor would require splitting the fleet into smaller groups, which the disruption field made significantly more complicated. 2 other proposals involved waiting, holding position, conserving resources, and hoping that either the field technology would develop a detectable weakness over time, or that coalition reinforcements, once the fleet's silence was noted at home, would find a way to break through from the outside. Then's logistics teams ran those numbers. The resource projections were manageable for weeks, possibly months. But coalition command at home wouldn't understand what had happened to the fleet. They would know only that communications had been lost, which could mean anything from technical failure to total destruction. The response would be confused and slow, and humanity's statement to the galaxy had already made it clear they were prepared to maintain the field indefinitely. The remaining 2 proposals both involved negotiation, with different opening positions. Then chose the simpler of the 2. He sent a single-line response to the communication channel humanity had used for their private message. We are prepared to negotiate. Identify your representative. The response came within the hour. Sisara. She knows us well enough to do this properly. Then looked at Sisara when she received the message on her terminal. She read it once, then looked up at him with an expression that was carefully neutral, betraying nothing of what she might have felt about being specifically requested by the species that had just contained the largest fleet in galactic history. They trust you. Then said, They trusted all of us, Sisara replied quietly. We voted to end that. They're being practical, not generous. The negotiation took 4 days. Sisara conducted it through narrow-band communications, with humanity's diplomatic team, the same. Team she had worked alongside for the better part of 3 decades. People she knew well enough to read between their careful formal language and understand exactly what they needed and what they were willing to accept. Humanity's terms were not punitive. This surprised Then when Sisara presented them. He had expected demands designed to permanently cripple coalition military capability. Territorial concessions, massive resource transfers, the kind of terms a species imposed when it wanted to ensure an enemy could never threaten it again. Instead, the terms were precise and practical. The coalition declaration against Earth was formally withdrawn and permanently struck from the record. All coalition military action against human territory ceased with immediate effect. A new treaty framework replaced the existing one, structured with actual enforcement mechanisms, independent monitoring, and clear consequences for violation, rather than the gentleman's agreement the previous alliance had effectively been. In exchange for these terms, the coalition fleet went home, intact, every ship undamaged, every crew member alive and unharmed. Sisara signed the agreement on behalf of the coalition, using the formal authority her diplomatic position carried. She knew the 12-member councils would object loudly when the fleet returned. She also knew they would accept the terms quietly, because the alternative was admitting publicly to the galactic community, which had watched everything. that their combined military had been contained completely without a single significant battle by a species they had voted to destroy based on a projection about the future. The disruption field dropped the moment the agreement was countersigned by humanity's representatives. Faster-than-light navigation came back online, communications restored. The Coalition fleet, entirely intact after days of complete immobility, began the long process of organizing for departure. As the ships prepared to leave, one of Then's senior officers, the same one who had laughed at the first human broadcast, back when the fleet was still confident and the operation had seemed simple, approached him quietly. "I've been thinking about the word they sent," the officer said, "at the very beginning, before any of this started," then looked at him waiting. "They said run," the officer continued. "We thought they were frightened. We thought it was bluster." He paused. "They weren't talking about themselves, were they?" Then watched the stars through the viewport for a moment before answering. "No," he said quietly. "They were talking about us." Sasara, standing nearby and overhearing, said nothing. She was already composing in her mind the document she would write when she returned home. A full account of everything that had happened, everything she had warned about, and everything the Coalition needed to understand going forward if it intended to exist peacefully in a galaxy that contained humanity. She would title it simply, "What We Should Have Known." Across the galaxy, in the weeks following the fleet's return, the story spread to every civilization that received transmissions, not as rumor or exaggeration, but as documented fact, confirmed by independent observers who had watched every stage of the conflict in real time. A species the Coalition had turned on. A warning sent in one word before the first ship crossed the border. A patient, 20-year preparation activated precisely when needed. A fleet of hundreds of ships contained completely, without casualties, then released in exchange for fair and reasonable terms. The final line of the Independent Observer Report, filed across the galactic community and read by military strategists, diplomats, and council members in dozens of civilizations, was brief and plain. When humanity said run, they were not afraid. They were offering the only warning they intended to give. The galaxy would do well to remember what happened to the fleet that didn't listen, and to understand that the fleet came home only because humanity chose to let it.